In the quiet medieval village of Willowbend, where the houses leaned slightly to one side and the streets wandered in gentle curves, as if unsure where they were going, people lived at a leisurely, unhurried pace. The days passed softly, with the faint sound of distant chickens and the slow clack of carts rolling over uneven stones. Life was simple, not particularly exciting, and certainly not fast. Even the bells in the church tower seemed to ring a moment later than expected, as if they too were sleepy. In this slow and gentle world, food also moved at its own pace. Meals were rustic, plain, and rarely surprising. But every now and then, between chores or after a long afternoon spent doing almost nothing, the villagers enjoyed a small, unnecessary indulgence, what one might call in a distant future, junk food. They didn't have colorful wrappers or flashy stalls, and no one ate these snacks in a hurry. Instead, they were all little treats made from leftovers, scraps, or whatever was lying around. They were simple, imperfect, and strangely comforting. Every morning before the sun fully decided to rise, the baker, Master Aldrich, opened the shutters of his small stone bakery. He didn't move quickly. He rarely did. He tied his apron with slow, patient hands and began kneading dough as though the dough itself might get offended if rushed. From these daily tasks came his accidental creation, little crunchy honey crust bits. They were born not from innovation but from scraps, leftover pieces of dough that he baked until they hardened into sweet, oddly shaped fragments. He brushed them with honey, which dripped lazily over the surface and crystallized just enough to make them sticky. Villagers wandered by and bought these treats with the same calm attitude as everything else in Willowbend. They chewed slowly, savoring the mild sweetness, sometimes fishing out the pieces stuck in their teeth, but never complaining. In a quiet town, even an unimportant snack could feel oddly satisfying. Not far from Aldrich's bakery stood the cheese shop, run by Bram, a man so slow-moving that some people wondered whether time itself flowed differently around him. He had a way of drifting across his shop like a cloud that never quite found the wind. Bram was responsible for another form of medieval junk food, fried cheese clusters. They were not a recipe he discovered intentionally. One day, he left cheese too close to the fire, and it melted down into uneven, lumpy shapes. Instead of throwing them out, Bram sprinkled herbs over them, let them cool, and sold them at a modest price. Somehow this became a hit. The clusters were soft in the middle, crisp on the outside, slightly greasy, and never exactly the same from one batch to another. Some pieces tasted wonderful. Others tasted vaguely burnt. But the villagers accepted this inconsistency as part of the charm. After all, nobody in Willowbend ever expected perfection. A short walk always taken slowly, as per village tradition, led to a tiny wooden stall where Oswin the merchant sold roasted pea kernels. His stall looked crooked, and Oswin himself looked permanently puzzled, as though surprised to still be in business. The kernels weren't complicated, dried peas toasted until they popped a little. Oswin dusted them with whatever spice or herb he had on hand. Some days the peas were spicy. Some days they tasted like dust. And some days they had no taste at all, only the faint crackle of being roasted over a small fire. Still, villagers bought handfuls at a time, partly because the crunch broke the town's silence with a pleasant sound, and partly because the act of chewing gave them something to do on long, uneventful afternoons. On the outskirts of Willowbend lay Lisbeth's orchard, where fruit trees grew in quiet rows, their branches swaying gently in the slowest breeze imaginable. Lisbeth believed the trees appreciated calmness, so she moved through the orchard with deliberate, peaceful steps. From the fruits she harvested, she created another medieval treat: fruit leather. This wasn't the soft, colorful kind seen in modern times. It was darker, tougher, and required determination to chew. Lisbeth mashed berries or apples into a thick paste, spread it onto wooden boards, and let the sun do the rest. For days, sometimes weeks, the mixture dried slowly until it peeled off like a thin, chewy sheet. Children loved it because the sticky texture made eating feel like an adventure. Adults liked it because it lasted a long time, perfect for nibbling during long hours in the fields. Then there were the villagers who gathered at the unnecessary market, a name they used with affectionate honesty. This wasn't a place for essential goods like flour or wool. Instead, it was a market filled with small indulgences that no one truly needed but everyone mildly enjoyed. There were candied nuts, stuck together in hard little clumps. Bread ends dipped in oil and grilled until crisp. Puffed grains coated in syrup that was always a bit burnt. Nothing was uniform, nothing was fancy, and nothing came with instructions. You simply bought a handful of whatever looked interesting, tasted it, shrugged, and continued your slow walk through the square. But perhaps the most unusual snack maker was Garin, the wandering fry cook who visited the village every few months. Unlike the other villagers, Garin had a flicker of energy, though still not enough to be considered fast by any modern standard. He carried with him a portable pan and a pouch of simple ingredients, and he would fry almost anything: leftover dough, slivers of root vegetables, mushy apples, bits of cheese, even old porridge. When the oil sizzled, villagers gathered around, fascinated by the miniature spectacle. Garin's fried dough scraps were especially popular. Each piece was shaped oddly, crisped unevenly, and seasoned haphazardly. And yet they disappeared quickly, one slow bite at a time. Life in Willowbend continued like this, with its small pleasures and even smaller surprises. Medieval junk food wasn't flashy or addictive, but it had a gentle charm. These snacks weren't necessary for survival, but they were necessary for comfort. They gave people something to munch on during long walks, something to share with neighbors on quiet evenings, something to look forward to during uneventful days. One evening, as the sun slowly sank behind the hills, painting the sky in faint shades of orange and pink, the villagers gathered in the central square. Some sat on the edges of barrels, others leaned against carts. Children dangled their legs off stone steps. Everyone had a little snack in their hands. Honey bits stuck to fingers. Fried cheese softened in the warmth of a lantern. Roasted peas rolled across rough wooden tables. Fruit leather stretched between small fingers. Fried dough pieces crackled faintly as they cooled. The villagers ate quietly, chewing slowly, watching the sky fade. No one rushed, no one spoke loudly. The entire square exhaled as the day settled into night. The scent of warm oil, toasted grains, and faint honey drifted lazily through the air. And in that moment, surrounded by simple treats made from scraps and leftovers, the people of Willowbend felt content. Their world was small, their lives uneventful, and their snacks humble, but every bite tasted like the slow, peaceful rhythm of their days. Medieval junk food wasn't about excitement. It wasn't about flavor explosions. It wasn't even about cravings. It was about the quiet comfort of something unnecessary, something simple, something made with no rush at all. In a world where everything moved gently, these little treats blended perfectly into the sleepy heartbeat of the village. Reminder that even in the simplest times, people still like to nibble on something small, something pleasant, something just a little indulgent, even if it served no purpose other than adding a moment of quiet joy to a quiet life. And so, in the soft glow of lanterns and the cool whisper of evening, the villagers continued to chew slowly, breathe calmly, and savor the peaceful truth of medieval junk food, that sometimes the smallest, simplest bites are the ones that make the long, quiet days feel just a little warmer. The quiet evening in Willowbend stretched on like warm honey dripping from a spoon. Most of the villagers had already settled into their favorite sitting spots, places they returned to every evening without fail. Some sat on the low stone wall beside the well, its surface smoothed by generations of people leaning on it during calm, uneventful nights. Others rested on overturned crates or slouched lazily against doorways. It didn't matter where they sat. The entire town was comfortable in its familiarity. A few lanterns flickered softly, their small flames swaying as if yawning in the gentle breeze. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily upward, twisting into slow spirals before disappearing into the deepening sky. The faint sounds of crunching, chewing, and quiet murmurs floated through the air, not lively conversations, just the soft, soothing noise of people who had nothing urgent to say. Aldrich the baker also stepped outside, carrying a small basket of his honeycrust bits. He moved without hurry, each step measured, almost meditative. He never rushed his baking, and he never rushed his evenings either. As he lowered himself onto a wooden bench near his shop, a few villagers wandered over, trading coins for handfuls of the sweet, sticky little pieces. It wasn't unusual for him to sell a few snacks after sunset. Some people said the honey tasted different at night, as though the quietness added its own flavor. Not far away, Bram the cheesemaker padded out of his shop, holding a wooden tray of freshly cooled fried cheese clusters. The tray wasn't full. Bram rarely made large batches, but the villagers didn't mind. They were accustomed to his slow, patient process. If Bram made too much in one evening, it would suggest he had rushed, and nobody wanted that for him. Bram moved like a man who respected the pace of life, and the villagers mirrored that pace without thinking. Oswin the pea merchant wandered from stall to stall, carrying a cloth bag of roasted pea kernels. His steps were slightly uneven, giving the impression that he drifted more than walked. Every so often he would pause, tilt his head, and sink deep in thought, as though reflecting on something profound, though most people suspected he was simply trying to remember whether he had eaten dinner. When someone waved at him for a handful of roasted peas, he would smile, open the bag, and let them scoop out as much as their hands could comfortably hold. He never measured, and no one expected him to. Near the orchard path, Lisbeth approached with a stack of fruit leather strips neatly rolled and tied with thin strands of dried grass. Her movements were even gentler than usual, as though she didn't want to disturb the night itself. She handed out the fruit leather without speaking much, offering small nods instead. The children, who were normally more energetic than the adults, chewed slowly tonight, savoring the chewy texture as they watched the lanterns flicker. Even they seemed lulled by the sleepy atmosphere. And then, as if arriving on cue, Garin the wandering fry cook reappeared at the edge of the square. He carried his little pan, a clay jug of oil, and a pouch filled with mysterious bits and pieces he had collected along the road. His clothes smelled faintly of campfire smoke and seasoned flour, and his smile, though subtle, carried a friendliness that the villagers welcomed without question. Garin set up his small cooking station, placing a handful of leftover dough scraps into a wooden bowl. He lit a tiny fire using dry grass and thin twigs, blowing gently until the flames grew steady. The villagers watched with mild curiosity, not excitement, because nothing in Willowbend was ever exciting, but a warm, familiar interest. The smell of warming oil began to drift through the air, adding a rich, comforting aroma to the soft evening. One by one, Garin dropped dough scraps into the pan. They sizzled and bobbed in the bubbling oil, turning golden in a matter of moments. Each scrap puffed up differently, some into smooth, rounded shapes, others into twisted, irregular pieces that resembled tiny clouds. Garin stirred them lazily, letting the heat do most of the work. When the scraps were done, he sprinkled a pinch of salt or herbs over them, depending on what he happened to have gathered during his travels. He offered them to the villagers in small wooden cups, each cup warm to the touch and filled with oddly shaped, pleasantly crisp treats. People ate slowly, as always. One woman took a bite, nodded slowly, and murmured, "Quite good." A man beside her agreed, though he didn't say much, he simply chewed thoughtfully. Nobody held strong opinions about the snacks. They were simply part of the rhythm of Willowbend life. Even the children ate quietly, their eyes reflecting the soft glow of lanterns as they focused on each bite. As the night deepened, more villagers joined the square, drawn not by noise or celebration, but by the familiar comfort of shared quietness. The air was cool and mildly scented with honey, herbs, roasted peas, and the faint sweetness of dried fruit. It wasn't the sort of aroma that demanded attention, but rather one that drifted gently, inviting people to relax without realizing it. Some villagers began exchanging stories, not dramatic or thrilling tales, but small, unimportant recollections from their week. One old man talked about how his goat had stood perfectly still for 3 hours, staring at a fence post as though contemplating its existence. Another woman described a moment when she dropped her wooden spoon and watched it roll off her table, only for it to stop right before hitting the floor. The stories were mundane, but the villagers listened with polite interest, nodding slowly as though each detail mattered. The longer the evening stretched, the more the square felt like a shared living room, with the sky acting as its ceiling and the lanterns as soft candlelight. Everyone's movements were unhurried, their breathing steady, their voices low and calm. Even the animals seemed to understand the mood. The dogs slept near their owners' feet, the cats curled up beneath benches, and the horses in distant stables shifted quietly in the dark. The snacks remained at the center of this slow gathering, a small celebration of comfort, simplicity, and routine. Nobody thought of them as special, and yet everyone appreciated their presence. They were reminders that life could be enjoyed in tiny moments, that flavor didn't need to be intense to be pleasant, and that even scraps and leftovers had a place in the hearts of the villagers. As the stars began to reveal themselves in the sky, twinkling softly like sprinkled salt across a dark cloth, Willowbend drifted further into tranquility. A few villagers dozed off where they sat, their heads drooping gently, their breaths deep and even. Others quietly continued nibbling, savoring each bite for as long as possible. The snacks lasted longer when eaten slowly, and in Willowbend, everything was eaten slowly. The night continued like this: soft sounds, gentle movement, and peaceful chewing. There was no ending point, no grand event, no moment of excitement. Life was simply continuing in its mild, steady way, and the villagers embraced it without question. And so the story of medieval junk food went on, not as a tale of dramatic discoveries or clever inventions, but as an ever-flowing description of small comforts shared among people who lived quietly, kindly, and without haste. They didn't need modern treats, bright packaging, or intense flavors. They didn't need hurry or noise or novelty. They simply needed warm scraps, sticky fruit, roasted peas, cheesy clusters, and honey bits, unnecessary pleasures for slow days and slow nights. And in the soft quiet of Willowbend, that was more than enough. The village square grew cooler as the night settled deeper, but the villagers didn't mind. Their cloaks and shawls, woven from thick wool and smelling faintly of smoke, kept them warm enough. A few people shifted in their seats, adjusting themselves with the slow, deliberate motions of those who had no reason to hurry. The old stone beneath them retained a bit of warmth from the day, adding to the gentle comfort of the evening. Far above, the moon climbed steadily through the sky, pale and round, dimming the lantern light just enough that Willowbend felt wrapped in a soft haze. Clouds drifted lazily, never quite covering the moon, but gliding past it as though they too were part of the village's slow rhythm. Aldrich leaned back on his bench, resting the basket of honeybits beside him. He watched the villagers with a mild, contented expression, the kind that came from knowing that life didn't need to be exciting to be meaningful. Every now and then, someone approached him for another handful of the sweet crust pieces, and he handed them out with the same patient smile. He didn't count how many pieces he had left. He simply let the basket empty at its own quiet pace. Bram the cheesemaker found a comfortable spot on a crate. His tray of fried cheese clusters sat on his lap, and he chewed thoughtfully on one of the crisp, uneven pieces. Bram never rushed his eating. He believed that cheese tasted different depending on how slowly he chewed it, and perhaps he was right. The people around him nibbled on the clusters he passed around, some taking tiny bites, others letting the warm cheese soften in their mouths before swallowing. Nearby, Oswin the pea merchant sank onto the ground, his back against the wooden leg of his stall. He opened his cloth bag and tilted it slightly, letting a few roasted peas tumble into his palm. The peas made a faint pattering sound as they fell, barely noticeable but oddly soothing. He popped them into his mouth one by one, crunching softly. Every now and then someone wandered over to ask for a handful, and Oswin offered the bag with a gentle nod. No words were needed. The shared comfort of roasted peas said enough. Lisbeth, the orchard keeper, had found a place near the square's lone tree, a small but sturdy oak whose branches spread out like sleepy arms. She sat with her legs tucked beneath her and unrolled a strip of fruit leather, tearing it quietly into smaller pieces. She handed them out to nearby children, who took them eagerly but still chewed slowly, as if the calm mood of the night had seeped into their bones. The fruit leather was tougher than fresh fruit, and the children enjoyed the challenge of softening it with long, steady chewing. Garin the fry cook continued working over his tiny pan. Though his movements were so relaxed, they hardly seemed like work at all. The fire crackled faintly, and puffs of steam rose each time he dropped in another piece of dough or sliver of vegetable. The scent of warm oil drifted lightly into the air, mingling gently with the other smells of the evening. When he finished another batch, he scooped the pieces onto a wooden plate and wandered through the crowd, offering them without a word. People accepted them with soft smiles, their eyes reflecting the firelight and the contentment of the moment. The snacks made their quiet circuit around the square, passing through hands and settling into small bites and slow, thoughtful chewing. No one spoke loudly. No one asked for anything specific. The simplicity of the food matched the simplicity of the night, each bite a reminder of how little it took to feel at ease. At one edge of the square, an old man named Simmons sat in his usual spot, an old stump that had been there longer than most of the villagers. He had been telling slow, meandering stories for years, not because they were particularly interesting, but because they filled time gently, like water trickling through a narrow creek. Tonight, he told a story about how he once dropped a potato on a hot stone, only to discover that it cooked itself after a few hours. This, he explained, was how he invented what he called a lazy potato treat, which was simply a potato forgotten in a warm place until it became soft enough to mash with 2 fingers. The villagers listened with patient smiles, not because the story was thrilling, but because someone told it the same way every year. There was comfort in its predictability. A few younger villagers gathered closer to the fire pit where Garin cooked, watching the flames dance slowly. The fire's glow reflected in their eyes, but their expressions remained calm, almost sleepy. One young man asked Garin what he planned to fry next, and Garin shrugged in his usual gentle way. "Whatever I find," he said softly. "Maybe roots. Maybe berries. Maybe bits of bread." The young man nodded, satisfied with the ambiguity. In Willowbend, certainty was optional. As the night deepened further, the lantern flames grew steadier, their light casting long, soft shadows across the square. The people shifted occasionally, stretching their legs or adjusting their cloaks, but no one made any move to leave. The square had become a shared resting place, and the villagers seemed perfectly content to sit together in the cool night air, surrounded by quiet voices, gentle chewing, and the comforting smell of simple snacks. The stone fountain in the center of the square burbled faintly, its water flowing lazily from the carved mouth of a weathered lion. The sound blended seamlessly with the murmurs of the villagers and the subtle crackling of Garin's fire. It was a background noise so familiar that most people barely noticed it, but it added to the soft texture of the night. Every now and then, someone would rise slowly to stretch or walk a few paces, only to return to their spot moments later. They moved as though they were part of the same gentle rhythm that guided the breeze and the flickering flames. Even their footsteps seemed quiet, cushioned by the slow, peaceful atmosphere of the evening. Children began to lean against their parents, eyelids drooping, fruit leather scraps forgotten in their hands. A few dozed off completely, breathing softly in the arms of those who held them. The adults patted their backs gently, careful not to disturb their sleep, though no one felt the need to carry them home just yet. The square was as safe and familiar as their homes, and the night air felt like a soft blanket draped over the village. Aldrich finally set down his empty basket, brushing crumbs from his hands. Bram's tray was reduced to a few small cheese pieces. Oswin's bag of peas had grown noticeably lighter, and Lisbeth's stack of fruit leather rolls had dwindled. Garin's pan still sizzled from time to time, but even he seemed to be slowing, letting the fire breathe quietly for longer stretches between batches. Still, no one felt the need to end the evening. It hung in the air like the last note of a lullaby, lingering gently, refusing to fade completely. The villagers continued to sit, continued to nibble, continued to share small stories and soft laughter. And the snacks, though humble and simple, remained at the center of it all, not because they were special, but because they were familiar. They were part of the fabric of Willowbend, woven into the slow, steady life that everyone accepted without question. Medieval junk food did not need bold flavors or exciting textures. It did not need novelty or extravagance. It simply needed to exist, to be shared, to be enjoyed quietly under the pale glow of the moon. And in the steady breathing of the night, in the gentle murmurs of the villagers, in the slow movements and the sleepy smiles, the snacks found their place not as indulgences but as companions. Small comforts in a world that moved at the calmest pace imaginable. The night stretched on, soft and endless, like a story with no need for a final line. And so Oswin continued nibbling his way through the town's forgettable treats, strolling with the same slow, unhurried rhythm that made even the pigeons lose interest in him. He passed by a young apprentice turning a spit of tiny, overly salted birds. They were the kind of snack that people bought only because they looked impressive stacked together, crispy, but mostly bone. The boy waved one at Oswin, who politely declined. He had once eaten one at a midsummer fair. The crunch still haunted him. It was too much commitment for too little reward, he thought. Medieval junk food often had that problem. Lots of chewing, very little to show for it. Further along the road, he found a stall selling honey droplets, little hardened beads of honey rolled in flour. They stuck to your teeth like they were trying to live there permanently. Oswin bought one out of courtesy, chewed thoughtfully, and immediately regretted how the sweetness clung to the corners of his mouth. Still, he admired the patience required to make something so tiny and yet so aggressively sugary. A true achievement in unnecessary effort. Nearby, a baker laid out trays of something called festival twists. These were thin ropes of half-baked dough, knotted in strange shapes, overly sprinkled with herbs no one could actually identify. Oswin picked one up, sniffed it, and concluded it smelled like a garden the morning after rain. Not terrible. Not wonderful. Just mildly edible, which was all medieval snacks ever promised to be. And then there were the fried cheese lumps. No one knew who invented them, only that they appeared every year during cooler months. Thick, chewy, saltier than seawater, and with a texture that felt like biting into a warm, stubborn stone. Oswin watched a group of children gnawing on them happily, their faces shining with grease. He smiled. Medieval junk food wasn't always delicious, but it was always loyal. It came back every season, unchanged, unapologetic. He wandered deeper into the marketplace until he found an older woman at a tiny table selling travel bites. These were little squares of mashed grains mixed with bits of dried fruit and just enough oil to hold everything together. They crumbled immediately. Oswin bought one, took a single bite, and spent the next minute quietly chasing crumbs around his palm. It tasted like something that wished it were bread, but gave up halfway through the attempt. He continued walking. The air smelled faintly of roasted seeds, another popular junk food of the time. Vendors would toss handfuls of them into small clay bowls and heat them over a fire until the seeds snapped loudly enough to make passersby glance over. People loved the sound more than the snack itself. Oswin tried a few burnt at the edges, surprisingly bitter, and yet strangely satisfying because they fit in the palms so neatly. Then came the spiced cider stands, though cider in medieval towns was more of a cloudy, unpredictable drink than a snack. Still, people sipped it like a treat. Some batches were pleasantly warm and fruity. Others tasted like someone dropped too many spices in by accident and decided to serve it anyway. Oswin's cup that day was polite enough, warm, mildly tangy, and just bland enough to soothe the senses as he wandered. Everywhere he went, he found more of the same charmingly mediocre food. Roasted beans that cracked loudly but tasted faintly of ashes. Thin apple slices dried so long they curled like old parchment. Sticky barley cakes that stuck to fingers long after the flavor faded. None of it was remarkable. None of it was terrible. All of it was exactly what made medieval junk food comforting in its own quiet, sleepy way. There was a kind of peace in it, a slow acceptance that food didn't need to surprise, impress, or overwhelm. It just needed to exist, to fill pockets and hands and afternoons. Oswin paused at the edge of the marketplace and let out a soft sigh. The kind that came from a full stomach, not with richness, but with simple, unexciting satisfaction. And as the sun dipped lower and vendors began packing away their baskets, Oswin realized something about medieval junk food. It wasn't about flavor. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about small moments, the quiet pause between chores, the treat shared after long work, the tiny joy found in an otherwise ordinary day. It was boring, yes, wonderfully, soothingly boring. Just the way Oswin liked it. Oswin lingered near the fading glow of the marketplace, listening to the quiet clatter of wooden stalls being folded, baskets being stacked, and vendors humming tired little tunes to themselves. The day was ending exactly the way he preferred, slowly, without hurry, drifting into a comfortable sort of nothingness. He wandered past a man who was sweeping crumbs from his table into a small cloth bag. Inside were the leftovers of the day, bits of fried dough, a few crushed sugared nuts, flakes of pastry that had peeled off like old bark. The man noticed Oswin watching and offered him the bag with a shrug, saying, "For the birds." Oswin nodded politely and moved on. Even by medieval junk food standards, that was a level of blandness too advanced for him. As he rounded a corner, he found a pair of travelers sitting on overturned crates, sharing what looked like a road snack, a dense slab of cold oat mush pressed together with lard. They sliced it with a small knife, then chewed with the determination of people solving a puzzle. Oswin admired their bravery. The snack wasn't bad, it was simply the kind of food that made no promises and kept them all. He continued wandering. At one stall, a woman was selling the medieval equivalent of candy, little sticks of boiled wort. They were brown, hard, slightly shiny, and tasted like sweetened tree bark, if the tree bark had been left too long near the fire. Oswin tried one once years ago and remembered the sensation of his jaw giving up before the candy did. He shook his head and smiled at the memory. Medieval sweets were less treats and more commitments. Not far from that stall was a man roasting onions on hot stones. This was considered a delicacy by those who appreciated strong flavors, though most found it overwhelming. Oswin watched as he sprinkled ash-dry herbs over the onions with a flourish. People bought them in pairs and ate them slowly, as though each bite required emotional preparation. The scent was sharp enough to bring water to the eyes, but strangely comforting in the same way a stubborn winter wind could feel familiar. Oswin drifted to another table, this one offering crispy grain puffs, tiny, round pieces of toasted barley that popped softly when bitten. They were one of the lighter medieval snacks, often given to children or tired workers. He bought a small bundle wrapped in cloth. They had no strong taste, hardly even a scent, but the little popping feeling between his teeth was quietly entertaining. Sometimes a snack didn't need flavor if it had personality. As he munched, he walked past a group of shepherds who had brought with them a pot of warm shepherd's dip, a simple, thick mixture of herbs, curds, and olive oil. People dipped old bread into it until the bread softened into something almost soothing. Oswin didn't partake, but he enjoyed watching the slow rhythm of dipping and chewing. Everything moved at the pace of a sleepy afternoon. The sky deepened into a soft blue as the final torches flickered along the street. Oswin's steps grew slower, timed with the steady rhythm of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. He wandered toward the outskirts of town where the path turned quieter, bordered by low stone walls and tall grass. There, at the very last stall, an elderly woman sat selling moon biscuits, plain round cakes baked with just enough honey to keep them from tasting like pure flour. They were called that not because they resembled the moon, but because they were eaten mostly at night when people needed one small excuse to stay awake a little longer. Oswin bought one, broke it in half, and found its familiar softness pleasantly dull. He took a bite. It tasted exactly like a biscuit should taste when the world was quiet and the night was unhurried, simple, steady, and completely forgettable in the most comforting way. He walked on, the moon biscuit disappearing with each slow chew. A gentle breeze brushed past him, carrying the faintest sense of all the day's snacks: herbs, smoke, honey, grain, and something vaguely burnt that he couldn't quite identify. It all mixed together into one sleepy aroma, the kind that made his mind drift without direction. Medieval junk food, he realized, wasn't about excitement. It was the opposite. It was about small, steady flavors that required no thought, no anticipation, no judgment. Food that filled the quiet spaces in life without trying to change anything. He liked that. He liked it more than he would ever admit. As he reached the small bridge at the edge of town, Oswin paused, leaning against the worn wooden railing. The river beneath flowed in a slow, lazy current, mirroring the calm settling over his thoughts. In his pocket remained the last few grain puffs, light, unremarkable and yet perfect for the moment. One by one, he ate them, each tiny pot blending softly with the sounds of night. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable. Just simple comfort, exactly the spirit of medieval junk food. And Oswin, with the faintest smile on his face, continued toward home at the same slow, peaceful pace that had guided him all day. Oswin crossed the little wooden bridge with the same gentle slowness he carried everywhere, his boots tapping lightly against the planks, as though careful not to disturb the river moving beneath him. The night air had cooled just enough to soften the lingering smells of the market, leaving only a faint whisper of roasted grain drifting behind him. It clung to his cloak in a way that felt almost comforting, like the marketplace didn't want him to leave entirely. As he stepped off the bridge, he noticed a small cluster of boys sitting along the roadside, passing around what looked like a cloth bundle filled with something crackly. Curious, Oswin slowed even more, which was impressive, considering how slowly he already moved and observed them. Inside the cloth were thin shards of roasted root vegetables, sliced so unevenly that some pieces were almost burnt while others were still soft in the middle. They were sprinkled with nothing more than a pinch of ground salt. The boys called them night chips. They weren't chips in the modern sense, more like crunchy guesses. Each bite could be surprising in its own quiet way. Oswin watched one boy bite into a piece that shattered like dry leaves, while another chewed a softer bit that folded on itself like a tired blanket. The boys laughed, but not loudly, just the soft end-of-day sort of laughter that sounded more like yawns than excitement. Oswin gave them a small wave and continued on his path, the gravel crunching underfoot in a rhythm that felt strangely aligned with the evening. The deeper he walked into the outskirts, the more the sounds of the town faded into a distant hum. The torches behind him flickered, shrinking into tiny dots as the darkness ahead grew gentler, softer, almost velvety. Along the path, he came across old Harbin, the shepherd who lived alone at the edge of the fields. Harbin sat beside a low fire with a small pot resting in the embers. The pot emitted a faint, pleasant smell, something like warm milk mixed with herbs and old stories. Harbin greeted Oswin with a slow nod, as though nodding any faster would have been too energetic for the hour. Inside the pot was a snack Harbin fondly called resting broth, a very thin, very mild mixture made of milk, crushed barley, and a hint of mint. It wasn't quite food and wasn't quite drink. It was the in-between of both, meant to sit warm in the stomach without asking for attention. Harbin ladled some into a wooden cup and offered it to Oswin. Oswin accepted it gratefully. The broth tasted like nothing special, warm, slightly sweet and quiet. The kind of flavor that didn't linger, didn't surprise, didn't interrupt the peacefulness of the moment. It was comfort made liquid. Harbin explained that shepherds drank it on long nights when they had to stay awake, but didn't want their minds buzzing. It was medieval calm in a cup. After thanking Harbin, Oswin continued down the path, holding the empty cup until he found a small stone to set it upon. Every step grew softer, as though the world itself was settling into a long exhale. As he reached a fork in the road, he noticed a lone vendor packing away his things from a small wagon. Oswin recognized him, Grendel, the traveling snack seller who roamed from village to village, carrying unusual little food items that no one quite understood, but everyone bought out of curiosity. Tonight, Grendel's final unsold snack was something he called fog bites. They were tiny puffs of dough brushed with lightly sweetened water and left to dry until they formed a crispy little shell. Inside, however, there was mostly air. Eating them felt like biting into a slightly flavored breeze. Grendel offered Oswin one for free, mostly because he didn't want to carry them back home. Oswin popped the fog bite into his mouth. It made the faintest crackle, then dissolved as though it had somewhere else to be. He smiled. It was, without question, one of the most unremarkable snacks he'd ever tasted. But somehow it was perfect for the quiet night. He and Grendel exchanged a few slow words about the weather, the moon, and the general lack of excitement in the world. Then, with a soft nod, Grendel climbed onto his wagon and gently guided his mule down the road, disappearing into the faint glow of the moonlit fields. Oswin walked on. The road home curved gently, passing by old wooden fences and sleepy trees rustling only when the breeze felt motivated. As he walked, he found himself thinking about all the snacks he'd seen, sampled, and quietly judged throughout the day. None were extraordinary. None were the kind of food that sparked stories or songs, and yet each one had offered a moment. A tiny pause in the day, a breath, a space where life could slow down and settle. That, Oswin realized, was the true spirit of medieval junk food. It wasn't made for pleasure. It wasn't made to impress. It wasn't even made particularly well most of the time. It was made to fill the quiet spaces, the waiting moments, the gentle pauses between chores, conversations, and sunsets. And as he approached the small hill where his little cottage stood, Oswin felt the soft weight of sleep tugging at him. His feet moved slower, his breaths deeper, his mind floating in the calm fog of the day's many mild flavors. He reached his door, opened it, and stepped inside. The cottage was dim, warm, and familiar, much like the snacks he'd tasted all day. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing dramatic, just peacefully, perfectly ordinary. And in his pocket he found one last forgotten grain puff. A single tiny remnant of the day. He ate it. It popped, softly. Oswin placed his cloak on its usual peg, the wooden hook worn smooth from years of the same gentle routine. His cottage smelled faintly of dried herbs, old parchment, and the subtle earthy scent of the evening air he'd carried in with him. It was the kind of smell that never changed, comforting because it didn't expect anything from him. He lit a small oil lamp, its glow spreading slowly across the room like a yawn of warm light. Shadows stretched lazily along the walls, settling into corners as though preparing for sleep. Oswin moved with the same unhurried rhythm, each motion soft and deliberate, as if even his hands understood that the day had been full enough, though full in the quietest, most uneventful way. On the table sat a small wooden plate where he liked to keep any leftover snacks from his wandering. Tonight, it held only a few crumbs of barley cake and one slightly squashed honey drop he had forgotten about earlier. He inspected the honey drop, considered eating it, then decided its stickiness was too much commitment for the hour. Instead, he nudged it to the side of the plate, where it would likely remain until the next day or the next moment of mild hunger. Oswin lowered himself onto the small stool by his table and let out a soft breath. Not a sigh, just an exhale of a man settling into the gentleness of evening. His mind drifted back to the marketplace, to the boys with their night chips, to old Harbin's resting broth, to Grendel's dissolving fog bites that vanished almost as quickly as they were eaten. It struck him in a very slow and almost drowsy way that medieval snacks were like the flow of life itself, strange. Simple, sometimes oddly shaped, often quietly disappointing but strangely comforting all the same. Nothing tried to astonish. Everything tried simply to exist. And in that unimpressive existence there was something soothing. He rested his elbows on the table and looked through the small window near the door. Outside, the moon sat low and heavy in the sky, softly lighting the stone path leading back into town. He imagined the vendors now, at home, likely preparing for another day of stirring pots and folding doughs and roasting root vegetables into slightly burnt shapes. The idea made him smile. His attention drifted to a small basket near his cupboard where he sometimes stored ingredients gifted by neighbors' herbs, old grains, sometimes odd treats from travelers. Tonight, inside the basket, he noticed a small cloth wrap he hadn't opened earlier. Curious, he reached over and unwrapped it to find 2 pieces of what looked like dried sweetbread. It was a snack he had been given in passing by a baker earlier that afternoon. A drowsy loaf slice, the baker called it. Sweetbread left to dry until it became firm, almost biscuit-like, then dusted with the faintest hint of sugar, if sugar had been especially cheap and abundant. Which it certainly wasn't. He broke off a small piece and tasted it. The texture was rigid at first, then slowly softened as he chewed. The sweetness was present but shy, the kind that appeared only if one truly searched for it. The flavor reminded him of childhood, of the times when this sort of snack had been handed out during festivals and he, being smaller then, had believed it was the height of culinary excitement. Now older and far more aware of the sheer mediocrity of such food, he still found comfort in its familiarity. He finished the piece and placed the rest on the wooden plate. A faint rustling sounded outside his door. Oswin looked up but remained perfectly calm. The forest behind his cottage was home to creatures that moved quietly at night: mice, owls, perhaps even a fox or two hoping to find a forgotten scrap of food. Nothing alarming. Nothing unusual. Just another whisper in the long rhythm of evening. He stood and walked to the door, not to investigate but simply to feel the cool night air. Opening it slightly, he looked out at the soft darkness. Fireflies drifted near the trees, blinking with the slow patience of creatures that understood time differently. Oswin leaned against the doorway and breathed in deeply. The world smelled of dew settling on grass, cooling earth, and the faint traces of smoke from distant hearths. Somewhere faintly, he could almost imagine the lingering aroma of roasted onions from earlier, sharp, familiar, and oddly comforting in its stubbornness. Standing there, he realized that medieval junk food, in all its trouble and blandness, was tied to moments like this. It wasn't just something people ate, it was part of the rhythm of life. Part of the slow turning of days and nights. Every taste, however mild or questionable, was connected to the hearths, markets, fields, and hands that shaped the day. He stepped back inside and closed the door softly. The lamp flickered faintly, casting golden circles across the room. Oswin sat again at his table, resting his chin in his hand. The quiet pressed gently against him. Not heavy, not empty, just a soft, drowsy quiet that made his eyelids dip lower. He wasn't truly tired yet, but he was drifting, as if the entire day of mild flavors and gentle wandering had lulled his thoughts into a slow sway. His mind floated back to the moon biscuits, the barley cakes, the seed puffs, the roasted roots, the chewy cheese lumps. All the snacks he had encountered. And he found himself thinking not about their taste, but about the people who made them, sold them, shared them. How each treat carried a little story, even if it was the story of nothing happening at all. And perhaps that was what Oswin liked most about them. They didn't ask him to care. They didn't ask him to hurry. They didn't ask him to be impressed. They simply existed quiet, ordinary, and gently forgettable. Just like the day itself. He let out another slow, steady breath and allowed the calm to wash over him, settling deeper into the stillness of the night. Oswin sat for a long moment with his hands folded on the table, listening to the soft creaks of his cottage as the night deepened. The wooden walls, warmed during the day, now cooled and released tiny murmurs like old bones settling into rest. Even his stool gave a faint sigh beneath him, as though encouraging him to lean back and let the evening take its gentle course. He rose again, not out of urgency, but because the rhythm of the quiet night nudged him to move. He walked toward the small shelf near his bed where he kept odd trinkets collected over the years. A smooth river stone, a tiny carved sheep, a bent spoon that had refused to be straightened, and a small clay jar labeled simply snack dust. The jar contained crushed remnants of old treat crumbs of dried apples, tiny flakes of baked dough, and little specks of sweetened herb powder. It wasn't meant to be eaten, not really. Oswin kept it for the strange comfort of opening it now and then to smell the faint, ghostly aroma of a dozen forgotten snacks. Tonight, he lifted the lid and inhaled gently. It smelled like distant memories, faintly sweet, slightly dusty. Warm in the way old stories are warm even when nothing exciting happens in them. He smiled, closed the jar, and placed it back on the shelf. His gaze drifted to the window again. Outside, the moonlight lay across the ground like a pale blanket. The stone path leading toward town was now almost entirely silent. Only the soft crunch of a creature moving through leaves could be heard now and then, the forest's quiet breath joining the night. Oswin's stomach gave the smallest, most polite grumble, not a request for food, just a reminder of the long day. He considered the honey drop on the plate again. But no, it still seemed too sticky, too awake for this hour. Instead, he turned toward his cupboard and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside the box were several pieces of dried berry, leather-thin sheets of mashed berries dried in the sun until they became slightly chewy and just barely sweet. Medieval fruit leather wasn't flavorful or vibrant. It was more like a suggestion of berries, a memory of fruit rather than the fruit itself. Oswin tore off a small piece and let it rest on his tongue for a moment. The flavor, mild as it was, unfurled slowly. A hint of berry, a whisper of sweetness. A tiny reminder that even simple things held traces of nature's quiet kindness. He finished the piece and closed the box with the same careful gentleness he used for everything. The cottage now felt entirely wrapped in its nighttime calm. The oil lamp flickered steadily. The air felt heavier, hushed, as though it too were readying itself for sleep. Even the shadows on the walls seemed to sway in slow patterns, comforting in their softness. Oswin stepped toward his small hearth. Only a faint glow remained from the fire he had burned earlier, just enough to keep the room warm. He nudged one of the embers with the tip of a stick, watching the orange light pulse and fade like a tired heartbeat. He thought of the resting broth old Harbin had shared with him. The warmth of it. The way it had settled his thoughts into a kind of gentle floating. Medieval snacks often had that effect, not because they were extraordinary, but because they asked nothing from the mind. They let the mind wander like smoke from a soft fire. Oswin sat down on the low rug beside the hearth, stretching his legs out across the wooden floor. He leaned back until his shoulders touched the wall. The heat from the embers brushed against him in small waves like a warm breath. His eyes began to drift half-closed. Outside, an owl hooted once low, unhurried. Somewhere farther away, a dog barked twice, then stopped as if even it realized the night preferred quiet. The forest rustled faintly, as though turning over in its sleep. Oswin felt himself sinking deeper into the slow, dreamlike calm that had followed him since the marketplace. His thoughts wandered freely, drifting without direction. He thought about the roasted seeds popping loudly in little clay bowls, about the barley cakes breaking softly in his hands, about the fog bites dissolving like tiny breaths, about the night chips crunching under the dim lights of the road. Each memory slid into the next in one long, peaceful stream, like a river moving without urgency. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, minutes, or perhaps many gentle stretches of time. The night didn't measure minutes. It measured feeling. And the feeling was soft and steady, like a warm blanket laid across his mind. Eventually, with the smallest, slowest motion, Oswin pushed himself up and moved toward his bed. He lay down on the straw-filled mattress, its familiar shape greeting him like an old friend. The blanket felt cool at first, then warmed quickly against his skin. He stared at the ceiling, watching moonlight trace faint patterns across the wooden beams. The last thought drifting through his mind was simple and warm. Medieval junk food may not have been rich or exciting, but it had a quiet way of carrying the day into the night. And with that gentle thought, Oswin's breathing grew deeper, slower, softer, as the world around him slipped into its own slow, peaceful rest. The days rolled on in Braemere with the same quiet sluggishness, and Oswin's curiosity only deepened as he continued observing the tiny world of medieval snacking. The village, for all its routines and repetitions, had a strangely hypnotic rhythm that made every small action feel like a slow-moving play. Even the simplest task like boiling a pot of barley took so long, and with so little excitement that the mind drifted naturally into daydreams. Perhaps that was why the villagers loved their little treats. In lives so predictable, even a chew of something mildly crunchy felt like a grand event. On the 6th morning of Oswin's stay, he walked past the bakeress house and found the old man drying leftover dough on a cloth by the window. The pieces had hardened overnight into pale, brittle scraps. The baker lifted a piece, cracked it between his fingers, and nodded to Oswin as though sharing a secret passed down for ages. "Yesterday's dough," he said proudly. "Better than today's sometimes." Oswin took a piece and bit in. It tasted like flour, air, and regret. It was so dull he wondered if it was possible for a food to taste tired. And yet the baker chewed his own with the deep satisfaction of a man eating victory. Farther down the muddy road, he saw 2 shepherd boys sitting on a log, carefully peeling bark off a small branch. They weren't peeling wood for crafting or fire starting, they were peeling it to eat. Oswin blinked. The boys crunched the thin strips between their teeth like they were enjoying the finest treat in the kingdom. One boy explained, with great seriousness, that this particular type of treat tasted less terrible in the spring. Oswin tried a tiny strip. It tasted exactly like a stick, exactly, no surprises. No hidden sweetness, just tree. Yet somehow the boys looked pleased, as though they were sharing an exclusive delicacy. As the days warmed, another village habit emerged: fermented apple bits. Not cider, just apples that had fallen, grown too soft, and turned strange. Villagers poked at them with sticks, testing softness, then plucked the ones they claimed had good sourness. Oswin tried one. He regretted it instantly. It tasted like a fruit that had given up on life yet refused to leave. The villagers, however, ate them with a quiet shrug, as though accepting that in life even food sometimes disappointed you. And that was simply how things were. One afternoon, Oswin found several women sitting together outside a cottage, scraping burnt bits from the bottom of thin iron pans. When they saw him looking puzzled, one woman said, "The good parts always stuck," and indeed the little blackened fragments, tiny, brittle crumbs, were passed around as if they were precious. Oswin tasted one. It was smoky, bitter, and crunchy in a way that reminded him of burnt hope. But the women chattered cheerfully while nibbling the scraps, their faces bright as though enjoying something forbidden and indulgent. Evenings, he noticed, brought another sort of treat, ale foam. At the tavern, men would sit patiently with their wooden mugs, waiting for the foam to rise just enough to skim off with a finger. They licked the bubbles thoughtfully, as though savoring the essence of celebration without actually celebrating. The tavern keeper, wiping mugs with a rag that hadn't been fully cleaned since the previous decade, explained to Oswin that the foam was lighter on the stomach, which Oswin suspected meant free if no one sees you do it. The foam tasted exactly like air pretending to be ale. There were days when Oswin wondered if anyone in the medieval world had ever tasted actual excitement. Everything was so calm, so simple, so endlessly slow. Junk food, he realized, wasn't really about flavor here. It was about small comfort, tiny edible pauses in long, identical days. A hard barley puff, a chewy oat lump, a burnt bread corner. These weren't snacks, they were moments. Moments when the villagers could stop their weaving, chopping, mending, or plowing and simply chew. And in the quiet rhythm of Bramir, chewing was practically a hobby. As Oswin walked around at dusk, he saw old Thomlin again, soaking crusts in a bowl. Thomlin waved him over and offered one soggy piece with a hopeful smile. The crust drooped like wet leather. Oswin tasted it, mushy, warm, bland, and profoundly uneventful. Thomlin let out a satisfied sigh, as if nothing in the world soothed the soul quite like a piece of bread that had surrendered entirely to water. By nightfall, the village grew quiet again. Soft footsteps, distant bleating, the crackle of a tired hearth. Everything slowed until even Oswin's thoughts felt heavier, softer. He lay back on a stack of hay near the stables, listening to the faint chewing of a cow beside him. Even the animals, he thought, were snacking. Even they knew the comfort of a long, slow munch. And perhaps that was the entire truth of medieval junk food. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't even particularly memorable. But in a world lit by candles, paced by seasons, and hushed by fatigue, these quiet little bites were enough. Enough to break the monotony, enough to ease the mind, enough to make one moment feel slightly different from the last. Oswin exhaled, long and slow, letting the village's sleepy rhythm settle into his chest. Maybe he thought junk food didn't need to amaze you. Maybe in a world this slow, it only needed to exist. Night deepened over Braemere, and Oswin found himself wandering once more through the soft, dim glow of the streets. Lanterns flickered lazily, casting thin bands of light that barely touched the ground. Even the shadows moved slowly, drifting along the walls as if they too were obeying the gentle pace of the village. The world felt thick with calm, and Oswin's steps matched it perfectly, soft and deliberate, never hurried, never uneven. He passed the marketplace, now nearly abandoned. A few stalls remained, their owners dozing against their wares or tiding baskets in the slowest motions possible. One man was carefully counting a handful of roasted nuts, picking out ones that were too burnt or too pale, and then placing them back in neat rows. The man's methodical, almost ceremonial motions were mesmerizing, even if the end result was something that tasted only faintly of toasted nut. He took a small handful, offered one nut to a passing cat, and continued slowly crunching the rest. Nearby, a woman carried a basket of leftover barley cakes. The cakes were thick, uneven, and smelled faintly of burnt oats. She offered one to Oswin, who accepted politely. He took a bite. The cake was dense, dry, and utterly unremarkable. But he chewed slowly, letting the texture fill the pause between one thought and the next. The taste, or lack of it, became part of the rhythm of the night. He wandered toward the town square, where the fountain trickled quietly, its stone lion mouth dripping into the basin below. The sound was gentle, almost hypnotic. A few villagers remained, sitting on benches or leaning against stalls, nibbling on scraps they had collected over the day. One man had a piece of honey-drenched bread, a sticky, oversweet morsel that clung to his fingers. He ate it with the slow patience of someone who had eaten too many already, appreciating the stickiness as much as the taste. Oswin smiled faintly. Even the most unimpressive food had a way of marking the day. Each bite was a punctuation mark in the slow sentence of medieval life. No snack demanded attention, no flavor shouted for praise. Everything was quiet, undemanding, reliable in its mediocrity. He wandered past the stall where someone had left a small pile of dried apple slices. They were stiff, curling at the edges, and smelled faintly of nothing in particular. Oswin picked one up, let it snap in his fingers, and took a tiny bite. The taste was muted, almost like the memory of an apple rather than the fruit itself. The crispness filled his mouth and he chewed thoughtfully, appreciating the sensation more than the flavor. A few children played nearby, each clutching a small piece of roasted root vegetable or a leftover crumb of bread. They bit carefully, chewing slowly as though the act of eating itself deserved attention. Oswin watched them for a while, noting how even the youngest in Braemere had learned the slow rhythm of snacks. The way bites were savored more for the pause they offered than the taste. He moved on to the outskirts of the square, where a traveling vendor had set up a small fire. She roasted nuts in a shallow pan, turning them with deliberate care. The heat made the smell of the nuts faintly sweet, but nothing extraordinary. Oswin took a small handful. Each nut was slightly uneven in texture, some crisp, some soft, but he ate them with calm patience, letting the differences slide over his tongue without judgment. As he walked, he noticed old Harbin again, stirring the last of his resting broth in a small pot beside the road. The aroma was faint, almost imperceptible, but it reminded Oswin of earlier nights and the quiet comfort of simple warmth. Harbin nodded at him silently, and Oswin nodded back, understanding that no words were necessary to share this slow, contented moment. The village had settled entirely into the night. Only the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant owl broke the silence. Even the river beyond the fields moved sluggishly, as though aware that no hurry was needed. Oswin finally reached the small path leading to his cottage. He stopped and looked back at the village, its soft lantern glow fading into the distance. Every sight, every sound, every morsel of food he had encountered that day formed a gentle pattern, a rhythm of mundanity, a lullaby composed of the quietest notes. He stepped inside his cottage, placing his cloak on its peg, and setting the remaining snacks on the wooden table. The lamp flickered warmly, casting soft circles of light. He stretched slowly, his body melting into the familiar comfort of home. As he lay down on his straw mattress, Oswin thought of all the minor flavors he had experienced. The barley puffs, the roasted nuts, the brittle cakes, the dried fruits, the soggy crusts, the dissolving fog bites. None had impressed him. None had delighted him, and yet, somehow they were perfect. They were exactly what the night required. Small pauses, gentle comforts, unobtrusive companions in a world that moved too slowly to notice excitement anyway. He exhaled, long and soft, feeling the rhythm of the day settle into his bones. The lantern flickered once more, the shadows stretched long across the walls, and the room grew still. The last thought that drifted through his mind was faint, calm, and entirely uneventful. Tomorrow would bring more snacks, and the world would continue in its slow, steady, quietly satisfying way. And with that, Oswin's eyes closed, his breathing deepened, and the gentle hum of medieval life carried him into the softest, most peaceful sleep. Morning arrived softly in Braemere, though not with any suddenness. The sun rose slowly over the distant hills, spreading pale light across the cottages, cobblestones, and thatched roofs. Even the birds seemed to move at a careful, unhurried pace, hopping from branch to branch with the deliberation of creatures who understood that the day had no particular urgency. Oswin woke on his straw mattress, stretched his arms, and let out a small, contented yawn. The day ahead promised nothing extraordinary, which was exactly what he wanted. He dressed slowly, his fingers fumbling with buttons and ties in the way only someone accustomed to unhurried mornings could. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The village smelled faintly of smoke from chimneys, dew on grass, and the soft tang of yesterday's snacks still clinging to the edges of the marketplace. Everything was quiet, the villagers still emerging from their homes in a calm, gradual flow. Oswin wandered toward the central square. The baker had already set out a few trays of yesterday's leftovers, crusts, thin cakes, and hardened dough pieces. The smell was faintly sweet, but mostly just present. He took a small crust, letting it rest between his fingers, then nibbled it slowly. The texture was stiff, the flavor muted. He chewed deliberately, savoring the very mediocrity of it. Nearby, a group of children shared dried apple strips. One boy offered Oswin a piece. It was tough, curling slightly at the edges, the flavor only the faintest whisper of fruit. He took a bite and smiled, watching the children chew in careful, patient rhythm. Every crunch was gentle, unhurried, deliberate. The snacks did not demand attention. They simply existed, and the act of eating them was enough. At the edge of the square, a woman roasted seeds in a shallow pan over a small fire. The seeds popped quietly, almost lazily. Oswin took a few, letting them settle in his mouth, the slight crunch the only interruption to the soft murmur of the village. The flavor was faint, earthy, and slightly bitter, but not unpleasant in a way that required complaint. It was the perfect taste for a morning meant to be slow and deliberate. As he continued, he passed old Harbin, who was already stirring the remaining resting broth from the night before. Harbin smiled gently and offered a small cup to Oswin. The warm liquid was calm and simple, slightly thick with barley, faintly sweet with a hint of herbs. Oswin sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle into his stomach. It was comfort in a cup, the kind of small pleasure that required no commentary, no excitement, just quiet enjoyment. Farther along he noticed Grendel's wagon, parked quietly at the edge of town. The traveling vendor had unpacked tiny portions of fog bites, each one more unremarkable than the last. Oswin took one, letting it dissolve slowly on his tongue. The flavor was almost nothing, yet it held a peculiar satisfaction. Even emptiness, he realized, could be comforting if it arrived gently, without rush or expectation. The streets began to fill gradually with villagers, moving with a pace that allowed time for chewing, for tasting, for noticing the small details of the day. Some carried roasted roots, brittle cheese lumps, or dried fruit. Others held cups of thin, warm ale or bowls of soggy bread, softened in broth. The aroma was faintly sweet, faintly smoky, and entirely mundane. Oswin wandered through it all, sampling here and there. A crumb of barley cake, a chew of fruit leather, a crackle of roasted seed. Nothing remarkable, nothing memorable, but each bite offered a moment of pause. Each snack, however bland, was a tiny punctuation mark in the slow unfolding of the day. By mid-morning, the village square had settled into a gentle rhythm. People sat, chewed, nodded politely to one another, and returned to their chores with the same calm deliberation. There was no urgency, no clamor, no excitement. Even laughter was soft, measured, careful not to disturb the quiet air. Oswin found a bench near the fountain and sat. The water dripped lazily from the carved lion's mouth, the sound soothing in its slow repetition. He pulled out the last of his snacks, a piece of hardened honey drop, slightly sticky but manageable, and nibbled it quietly. The sweetness was faint, comforting. The texture was rough, yet oddly satisfying. And as he sat there, chewing slowly, watching the villagers move with gentle, deliberate steps, Oswin realized something. Medieval junk food was never about delight or flavor or indulgence. It was about rhythm. It was about patience. It was about filling quiet gaps in long, unhurried days with moments that were neither exciting nor memorable, yet somehow essential. The breeze drifted over him, carrying the faint smell of roasted grain, warm bread, and sun-dried herbs. The fountain burbled steadily. A cat wandered past, sniffing at crumbs and then settling to nap. A dog yawned and stretched. The day, like the snacks themselves, moved slowly, steadily, without urgency. Oswin closed his eyes for a moment. Each soft crunch of a snack, each quiet step, each distant murmur was a lullaby in its own right. A gentle, monotonous lullaby stretching the day into a slow, soothing arc. And in that gentle repetition, he found a calm so profound that nothing extraordinary could ever surpass it. He opened his eyes again. The sun was higher now, but the air still felt unhurried. He reached for another morsel, a small piece of barley cake, and began chewing slowly, deliberately, peacefully. And the village, with its soft, bland snacks, its lazy rhythms, and its quiet, unremarkable days, carried on around him.